Stacy sat on the edge of her bed, her arms wrapped tightly around William. His sobs shook his small frame, and she held on to him as though, in this moment, it might be enough to stop the world from shifting beneath them. His face was pressed against her shoulder, tears soaking through her worn sweater, but Stacy didn't care. She was trying to keep herself together, the weight of her decision pressing hard on her chest. "I promise I'll visit you all the time," she whispered, her voice soft but determined. "And when you turn 18, if you want, I'll help you get out too. We'll figure it all out. Together." William lifted his head slightly, his eyes red and puffy from crying. His lip quivered as he tried to speak, and it broke Stacy's heart to see him like this. I don't know what I'm going to do without you," he managed, his voice cracking. She wiped a tear from his cheek, her hand gentle. "You're going to be just fine. You're strong, William. You've got a good heart and you're smarter than you know. I'm so proud of you." "I'm proud of you, Stacy," William choked out between sobs. "Proud to call you my sister." The words hit her like a wave, and for a moment Stacy couldn't find her voice. She hadn't realized just how much that bond meant to her, how much this boy, this brother, had filled a space in her life that she didn't even know was empty. She hugged him tighter. "You'll always be my brother, William, no matter where I go." After what felt like an eternity, William pulled away, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve. His voice was steadier now. "I'll miss you, but I know you have to go. You deserve this." Stacy nodded, her throat tight. "I'll miss you too, but I'll come back, I swear." She stood up and grabbed her backpack, slinging it over her shoulder. Her hands were shaking, but she didn't let herself falter. She was ready. At least, that's what she kept telling herself. For the past 2 years, cooking in the foster home's kitchen had been her escape, her joy. She learned to cook all sorts of meals, from simple soups to homemade bread, and it had given her a sense of purpose. Now she hoped it would lead her to her next step. "I'll be okay," Stacy said, more to herself than to William. She gave him one last look and turned toward the door. "Take care of yourself, okay? And keep working on those drawings. You're going to be a great artist." William gave a small smile, still sniffling. "You better come back soon. Otherwise, I'll send you 1,000,000 texts until you do." Stacy laughed softly. "Deal." Later that night, sitting on her bed in the small room she had been given as her last night in foster care, Stacy scrolled through job listings on her phone. Most of the jobs were far away, requiring qualifications she didn't have, but she didn't let it discourage her. She was determined to find something that would allow her to do what she loved. Her fingers paused over a listing. Family looking for an at-home cook. It wasn't far from town, and it came with room and board. Her heart leapt a little as she read the description. This was exactly what she needed. Work that would allow her to live independently, doing something she knew she was good at. Without hesitation, she drafted a message to the family, introducing herself and explaining her experience. She hesitated for a moment, her thumb hovering over the send button. What if they didn't reply? What if she wasn't good enough? She shook off the doubt and hit send. Closing her eyes, she leaned back against the pillow, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her. Tomorrow her life would change. She was no longer a foster kid, no longer bound to the system. But that freedom came with its own fears. Fears she couldn't let William see. For now she focused on her new goal. Find a job and make it work. Stacy stood outside the large, ornate gate, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. The house loomed before her, its pristine exterior a stark contrast to the familiar chaos of the foster home she had left behind. She took a deep breath and pushed the button for the intercom. After a brief crackle, a woman's voice came through. "Yes?" "It's Stacy. I have an appointment for an interview. For the cooking position," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The gate buzzed, and Stacy stepped through, walking up the long driveway toward the front door. It wasn't long before the door opened, revealing a woman in a perfectly pressed uniform, her expression sharp and professional. "I'm Mrs. Turner, the head maid. Come in," she said, her voice clipped. Stacy offered a small, polite smile and stepped inside, following Mrs. Turner down a long hallway toward what appeared to be a small office. Mrs. Turner gestured for Stacy to sit, and Stacy took her seat nervously. She could feel the woman's eyes scanning her up and down, taking in her modest, simple clothes and, no doubt, the anxious look in her eyes. "So, you're looking to be a live-in cook for the family?" Mrs. Turner asked, her voice cold as she shuffled through some papers on the desk. "Yes," Stacy replied, trying to sound confident. "I've been cooking for years. I was in a foster home, and I helped prepare meals for the other kids every day. I've learned a lot, and I think I'm—" Mrs. Turner cut her off with a dismissive glance. "Foster home, you say? Not exactly formal culinary training?" Stacy swallowed hard but forced herself to continue. "No, not formal. But I know how to cook for groups, I've managed a kitchen, and I really love what I do. I can make a lot of different dishes, and I've always been responsible with the work." Mrs. Turner raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a smirk. "Cooking for children in a foster home is a bit different than cooking for a family of this caliber. We expect high standards here." Stacy could feel the tension in the room tightening around her. She wasn't sure what to say, so she simply nodded. "I understand, but I'm a fast learner and I'm committed. I won't let you down." The maid leaned back in her chair, still eyeing her skeptically. She asked question after question about Stacy's background, each one making it clearer that she was looking for reasons to dismiss her. It was as though every word out of Stacy's mouth was being picked apart, examined, and discarded. Suddenly, in the middle of another question, Stacy felt a sharp sting on the side of her head. She gasped, grabbing her temple as she turned to see what had happened. A bright orange toy bullet lay on the floor next to her chair. She glanced up just in time to see a boy, no older than 7, dashing out of the doorway, laughing hysterically as he disappeared down the hall. Stacy rubbed the side of her head, still wincing from the pain. She looked back at Mrs. Turner, expecting at least some reaction, an apology, maybe a reprimand for the boy. But the maid's face remained impassive. She just stared at Stacy as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. I'm sorry," Stacy said, still clutching the side of her head. Mrs. Turner finally moved, but only to roll her eyes. "If something like that bothers you, then I'm afraid you might not be suitable for this position. The children here can be quite spirited." Stacy felt a lump forming in her throat, but she forced herself to nod, her hand dropping from her temple. "I understand. I'll let you know if we decide to move forward," Mrs. Turner interrupted, standing abruptly and walking to the door, signaling that the interview was over. Stacy stood slowly, feeling the weight of rejection settling on her shoulders. She gave a small nod, forcing a tight smile. "Thank you for your time." Without another word, she walked out, her head throbbing both from the toy bullet and the realization that this opportunity, like so many others, was slipping away. Stacy took a deep breath as she stood outside the second house, the note with the address crumpled in her hand. Yesterday's experience still lingered in her mind, but she was determined not to let it discourage her. Today, the air was warm, the sky clear, and the weight of the previous day's disappointment felt lighter. She had to keep trying. The house in front of her wasn't nearly as intimidating as the last one. It was modest but cozy, with a small garden lining the path to the front door. The flowers blooming in the garden seemed to mirror the way Stacy felt. Hopeful, but still a little fragile. When she knocked, the door opened almost immediately. A man in his mid-30s stood there, smiling warmly. His casual appearance and kind eyes were a stark contrast to the cold demeanor of Mrs. Turner. "Hi, you must be Stacy," he said, extending a hand. "I'm James. Come in, please." "Thank you," Stacy replied, shaking his hand and stepping inside. The warmth of the house embraced her as she followed him into the living room. It was a comfortable space filled with bookshelves and soft furniture, a far cry from the rigid, sterile atmosphere of the previous place. "Can I get you anything to drink? Water, tea," James offered, gesturing to the kitchen. I'm fine, thank you, Stacey replied, sitting down gingerly on the couch, her hands resting on her lap. She had brought her resume, though it wasn't much, just a list of the experiences she had while cooking at the foster home. Still, she figured it was better to be prepared. I brought this, she said, handing him the resume. I don't have a lot of professional experience, but I've been cooking for years in the foster home I lived in. James accepted the resume with a quiet nod. He unfolded it and began reading, but his eyes stayed on the paper longer than necessary. Stacey could see the hesitation in his face, the way his brow furrowed slightly, as if he was unsure how to approach the conversation. Sensing his unease, Stacey decided to get ahead of the situation. She wasn't going to hide anything. If she was going to convince him, she needed to be honest. I don't have formal training in cooking, she began, her voice steady but soft. But I'm a fast learner. I had to be. I've spent the last few years cooking for groups of kids at the foster home, and I really enjoy it. It's what I'm passionate about. The truth is, I'm looking for a live-in position because I need somewhere to stay. I'm an orphan, and I don't have anywhere else to go. But I promise you, I'll work hard. I'll do whatever it takes to make it work. She paused, watching James's expression as he listened. His face didn't change much, but there was something in his eyes. A flicker of understanding, maybe even sympathy. I never knew my parents, she continued. I've been on my own for a long time, but I'm trying to build something for myself now. James folded the resume and set it on the coffee table, leaning back in his chair. He was quiet for a moment, processing everything she had just told him. Finally, he nodded. Thank you for being so open with me, Stacey, he said. I really appreciate your honesty. That's something rare these days. He ran a hand through his hair, glancing toward the window for a moment, as though gathering his thoughts. We used to have a cook here, an older woman named Maria, he explained. She was with us for 5 years. Wonderful cook, and honestly, she became part of the family. But recently, she had to leave. Her father passed away back in her home country and, well, to make a long story short, she never had her papers sorted out properly. When she tried to come back, she was denied entry. Stacey listened intently, sensing the weight of James's words. It was clear that losing Maria had been difficult for the family. I haven't really thought about hiring another live-in cook since, James admitted. My family and I have been traveling a lot lately, so I wasn't sure if it made sense. But seeing as we're back for a while, I figured I'd at least meet with someone, and here you are. He glanced at her again, and this time Stacey could feel his eyes taking her in, not with judgment but with consideration. Her calm demeanor, the quiet determination in her posture, it all seemed to resonate with him. You've been through a lot, haven't you? James asked, his voice soft. Stacey met his gaze, her eyes steady. Yes, but I'm ready to move forward. I want to work. I want to build something for myself. James nodded again, leaning forward slightly. You remind me of Maria in some ways. She had that same drive, that same need to be independent. I respect that. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension from earlier dissipating as they sat there. James seemed to be weighing his options carefully. After a brief pause, James continued, his tone casual yet thoughtful. We're not really looking for someone with a formal education, he explained. What matters more to us is that the meals are healthy, and we love a bit of creativity in the kitchen. If you can bring that, we're good. As he spoke, it slowly dawned on Stacey that he was offering her the job. Her heart began to race, and a small, hopeful smile crept across her face. Still, she needed to hear it clearly. So, she asked cautiously, almost afraid to believe it, does this mean I'm hired? James returned her smile, nodding. Yeah, you're hired. Stacey's eyes widened in surprise, disbelief washing over her. She had to fight the urge to jump up and down. Thank you, she exclaimed, her voice full of excitement. I'm ready to start right away, Mr. James. I won't let you down. James chuckled at her enthusiasm. Call me James. And no rush, Stacey. We'll get you settled in first. His warm smile reassured her, making the moment feel even more surreal. For the first time in a long while, Stacy felt like her hard work and patience were paying off. The house was quiet as James led Stacy through the hallway. His footsteps echoed lightly against the hardwood floor, while Stacy trailed a step behind, taking in every detail of the space she would soon call home. The walls were painted a soft cream color, adorned with family photos and framed artwork. Everything had a personal touch, from the vintage chandelier to the hand-woven rug in the living room. "So, this will be your room," James said, stopping in front of a small door near the kitchen. He opened it to reveal a cozy space with a narrow bed, a wooden dresser, and a window that let in a generous amount of afternoon sunlight. It wasn't much, but it was perfect for Stacy. She could already picture herself unwinding after a long day of cooking, maybe reading a book before falling asleep. "Thank you. This is perfect," Stacy said, the smile on her face growing even wider. She dropped her small bag on the bed and turned to face James, eager to begin. James nodded. "Glad you like it. And, as I mentioned earlier, there's a cleaning lady who comes in twice a week. Her name's Karen. You'll see her around. Then there's Amelia, the nanny. She handles most of the childcare, but we'd still love for you to spend some time with our son now and then." He listened carefully, nodding along. "Of course, whatever you need," she replied. It was strange how calm she felt now, after the initial nervousness had worn off. She wanted to make a difference here. It wasn't just about the job. It was about doing something she was good at, something she loved. They continued the tour, and Stacy took mental notes of the pantry's stock, the layout of the kitchen, and the various utensils she'd be using. Everything was clean and well organized. James seemed like a man who appreciated structure, but he wasn't rigid about it. As they reached the kitchen, James paused and glanced at his watch. "My wife Claire and our son Daniel should be home in about an hour. They've been at his gymnastics class, so you've got some time before the chaos starts," he said with a chuckle. Stacy smiled, though her mind was already racing with ideas. "Do you have any preferences for tonight's dinner? Or should I get creative?" James considered it for a moment. "Well, it's your first day. Feel free to get creative. That's why we hired you. I'm sure whatever you make will be great." Stacy felt a small thrill at the words, "That's why we hired you." It had been a whirlwind of an afternoon, but now the reality was setting in. She really was starting her first job. With a firm nod, she turned to the fridge and pantry, scanning the ingredients. As he left the kitchen, Stacy got to work. She moved with purpose, organizing the ingredients and starting her preparations. She worked quickly but with care, tasting everything as she went. She wanted this first meal to be special, something that would set the tone for her time here. Stacy had always loved cooking for others, but now, with a real job and real responsibility, it felt even more important. Every detail mattered. Stacy stood in the bright, modern kitchen, her hands busy chopping vegetables. The faint scent of garlic and onions filled the air as she sautéed them in a pan. She was determined to make this first meal count, something simple but flavorful, to show she could cook for a family. Her heart raced, though, knowing this wasn't just any dinner. It was her first night at her new job, and she was eager to prove herself. About an hour into cooking, the front door clicked open, followed by a burst of youthful energy. A little boy's voice echoed through the house, full of excitement. "Dad! Dad! I'm home!" That must be Daniel, James's 5-year-old son, Stacy thought, smiling to herself. She could hear his tiny feet thudding across the floor as he bolted toward the other end of the house, likely in search of his father. Then came the sharp, deliberate sound of heels striking the floor, faster, more controlled. The noise sent a shiver down Stacy's spine. She didn't have to guess. This had to be Claire, James's wife. She'd heard a bit about her but hadn't met her yet. Stacy focused on her work, stirring the sauce she was preparing for dinner, hoping her first interaction with Claire would go smoothly. The clicking heels stopped abruptly at the entrance to the kitchen. Stacy felt a presence before she even looked up. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw Claire peeking in, her perfectly manicured hand resting on the doorframe. Claire's sharp eyes scanned Stacy from head to toe, lingering on her messy apron and slightly flushed face from the heat of the stove. "Hello?" Stacy said, trying to sound upbeat, though her voice wavered slightly. Claire didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tilted her head, her expression unreadable as she continued her silent appraisal. After a long pause, she cleared her throat. "So," Claire began, her voice crisp, "you're the new cook?" "Yes, Ma'am," Stacy replied, trying to keep her tone respectful. "I'm Stacy." Claire didn't acknowledge the introduction. Instead, she stepped further into the kitchen, her heels clicking on the tiled floor. "How long have you been cooking?" she asked, her voice smooth but with a hint of something colder beneath. "A few years," Stacy answered, trying not to let her nerves show. "I helped out a lot at the group home. I like to make healthy meals." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Group home? And no formal training, I assume?" Stacy swallowed, her hands tightening around the spoon she was holding. "No, I haven't had formal training, but and yet James thought you were the best choice to feed our family." Claire cut her off, her tone sharp now, her lips forming a thin line. Stacy's heart sank a little. She had expected some skepticism, but not such blatant disapproval. She forced a polite smile. "I promise I'll do my best to meet your expectations." Claire looked at her for another long moment, then nodded curtly. "We'll see," she said, before turning on her heel and walking out without another word. Stacy let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She stirred the sauce absently, trying to focus on the task at hand, but her mind was spinning. Was it a mistake coming here? Maybe Claire was right. What if she wasn't good enough? Voices floated down the hall, low at first, but growing louder with each word. Claire's calm but cutting tone was unmistakable. "Really, James?" Claire's voice, though controlled, carried a distinct edge. "You couldn't find anyone else? Someone more appropriate?" Stacy's hands froze mid-chop. Her heart thudded in her chest as she strained to hear their conversation. "Claire," James replied, his voice defensive but still gentle. "She's young, she's eager, and she needs this job. I thought we agreed to give her a chance." "She's from a group home, James. No experience, no references, no formal training, and we're supposed to trust her with feeding our son." Stacy's pulse quickened. The word trust hit her like a slap. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. The conversation became muffled again, as if they had moved further down the hall, but she could still catch snippets. Enough to know they were arguing about her. James's voice rose slightly. "It's not about where she came from, Claire. It's about what she can do, and from what I've seen, she's more than capable." Claire's voice was cool and dismissive. "Capable? We'll see about that." Stacy's stomach twisted. Her hands trembled as she tried to focus on the dinner again, but her mind kept replaying Claire's words. Doubt crept in. What if Claire was right? What if she couldn't handle this? What if her first meal turned out to be a disaster? The clattering of dishes in the sink snapped her out of her spiral of thoughts. She took a deep breath, reminding herself why she was here. Stacy was carefully arranging the spaghetti on the plates when she suddenly heard the sound of little feet racing down the hall. She smiled, expecting to see Daniel's excited face, but then she heard him call out, his voice bright with anticipation, "Maria!" Daniel's voice rang out as he got closer. "Maria! Are you making my favorite?" Stacy's heart sank. Daniel clearly adored Maria, the family's previous cook. She didn't have time to dwell on it, though, because in the next instant, Daniel rounded the corner and froze when he saw Stacy standing there instead. His bright smile faded, and his shoulders slumped. "Oh," he mumbled, his face falling. "You're not Maria." Without another word, Daniel turned to leave, his small frame drooping with disappointment. Stacy's chest tightened at the sight of his sadness. She couldn't let their first meeting end like this. She had to do something to win him over, to make him smile again. A sudden idea sparked in her mind. She put down the spoon she was holding and called after him gently. "Hey, Daniel, wait." Daniel paused, turning slightly, his face still glum. "You know," Stacy began, walking over to him with a playful grin, "Maria might not be here, but I think I can do something pretty cool. Do you like magic?" Daniel blinked, a flicker of curiosity replacing some of the sadness in his eyes. "Magic?" he repeated, still unsure. Stacy nodded, lowering herself to his eye level. "Yep, I know a special trick. Want to see?" For a moment, Daniel hesitated. Then curiosity got the better of him, and he gave a small nod. "Okay, but you have to help me," Stacy said, her voice full of excitement. She glanced at the kitchen counter and spotted the bright red tomato she had been using earlier. "We're going to make this tomato disappear." Daniel's eyes widened, clearly intrigued now. He stepped a little closer. Stacy grabbed the tomato and held it out in front of her, making a show of concentrating really hard. "Okay, here's the trick. You have to close your eyes really tight, count to 3, and when you open them, the tomato will be gone. Can you do that for me?" Daniel squinted suspiciously, but eventually nodded again. "Okay." He shut his eyes tightly, his tiny face scrunching up with focus. 1, 2, 3. The moment he finished counting, Stacy quickly tossed the tomato behind her back and into a bowl sitting on the counter, making sure Daniel couldn't see it. When Daniel opened his eyes, his jaw dropped in astonishment. It's gone!" he exclaimed, his voice full of wonder. Stacy beamed at him, pretending to brush off her hands as if she had just performed the greatest magic trick of all time. "Ta-da!" she said proudly. Daniel's earlier sadness vanished, replaced by an ear-to-ear grin. He giggled, bouncing on his toes. "How did you do that? Where did it go?" Stacy laughed. "A magician never reveals her secrets. But I'll tell you what, how about I teach you another trick next time we make dinner together?" Daniel's face lit up at the idea. "Really? Really?" Stacy promised. "And maybe you can help me cook too. Sound good?" Daniel nodded eagerly, his earlier disappointment completely forgotten. "Yeah, that sounds fun." Just then, James appeared in the doorway, smiling as he watched the exchange. Stacy glanced up and gave him a small, relieved smile in return. Daniel ran over to his dad, tugging on his sleeve. "Dad, she did magic. The tomato disappeared. I like her." James chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "Sounds like you two are going to be good friends." As Stacy set the last plate down on the table, she felt the weight of Claire's eyes on her back. The air in the dining room was thick with anticipation, but she focused on arranging everything perfectly. She wanted the first family dinner she cooked to be just right. James sat at the head of the table, with Daniel to his right and Claire across from him, quietly watching Stacy's every move. Daniel, ever the bundle of energy, had been asking her rapid-fire questions from the moment they sat down. "Do you like spaghetti, Stacy?" he asked, bouncing in his chair. "Yes, I do," Stacy replied with a smile, though she could feel the pressure building. "Do you have kids?" Daniel asked suddenly, his wide eyes locked on her. Stacy hesitated, not expecting such a personal question. "No, I don't have kids," she answered softly, trying to keep her tone light. "Why not?" Daniel pressed, tilting his head in genuine curiosity. Before Stacy could respond, James stepped in, sensing her discomfort. "Daniel, buddy," he said with a gentle but firm tone, "let's focus on dinner, okay? I'm sure Stacy will tell you more later, but right now I'm starving." Daniel pouted a little but then nodded, turning his attention to the food on his plate. "Okay, Dad." Stacy silently exhaled, grateful for the intervention, but as she glanced up, she saw Claire watching the whole interaction. Claire's face was serious, her eyes still fixed on Stacy as she moved to bring the last of the food out. As Stacy placed a plate of spaghetti in front of Claire, she saw the woman's expression harden for just a second, her eyes narrowing at the dish. Stacy held her breath, wondering if Claire would find fault with the food before even tasting it. Once everyone had been served, James clapped his hands together and rubbed them eagerly. "All right, let's dig in." He twirled a forkful of spaghetti and took the first bite, his face lighting up as he chewed. His eyes widened in pleasant surprise. "Wow, this is really good," he exclaimed, his voice full of genuine approval. Stacy smiled from the kitchen doorway, but her attention was still on Claire. She listened as Claire, maintaining her composed demeanor, hesitantly took a bite of the spaghetti. The tension hung in the air for a moment as she chewed. Then, slowly, Claire gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Though she tried to keep her expression neutral, it was clear she liked the food. James caught this and couldn't hide his amusement. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, his grin widening. "Well, Claire," he said, raising an eyebrow. "What do you think?" Claire placed her fork down and dabbed the corners of her mouth with a napkin. She gave a small, reluctant smile. "It's good," she admitted, her tone grudging but honest. "Actually, it's very good." James's grin broke into a full-blown smile, and with an exaggerated pump of his fist into the air, he laughed. "I knew it. I told you Stacy would be great." Claire shook her head slightly but couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. For the first time that evening, her posture seemed to relax. All right, she said, glancing at her husband. "You were right." From the kitchen, Stacy could barely contain her excitement. She clenched her fists and shook them in a small, silent victory dance, feeling the tension that had built up in her chest melt away. They liked her food. Even Claire, difficult, critical Claire, had complimented it. She had passed her first test. As the family continued eating and chatting, the warmth in the room grew, and Stacy felt a sense of accomplishment wash over her. She had made it through her first dinner with the family, and it had been a success. Stacy had settled into the rhythm of her new life with James, Claire, and Daniel. She had been cooking meals for the family for several months now, and every day she felt a little more at home in the household. The once daunting task of winning over Claire had been accomplished, and the moments of shared laughter with Daniel made her days brighter. She often found herself smiling, feeling a sense of peace and belonging that had eluded her for most of her life. For the first time, it felt like she was building something stable, something real. One afternoon, after preparing dinner early, Stacy found herself with extra time. The house was quiet as James and Claire were still at work, and Daniel was out with the nanny. Instead of heading back to the small bedroom near the kitchen, she decided to take a walk through the house, something she rarely did. The house was grand but not overly showy. It was filled with warmth, each room meticulously decorated but lived in, with personal touches scattered throughout. Toys in one corner, family photos in silver frames lining the walls. Stacy found herself in the living room, standing in front of a large framed photograph on the mantel. In the picture, Daniel was nestled between his parents, their arms wrapped around him protectively. James was smiling, looking proud and strong, while Claire's usually serious face had softened into a loving smile. Daniel was grinning with his small arms wrapped around their necks, the picture of a happy family. Stacy's heart ached at the sight. She stared at the image for a long moment, feeling the familiar pang deep inside her chest. She had never known that kind of family, the warmth of a mother's embrace or the protection of a father's love. All she had were faded memories of being handed over to strangers, shuttled from one foster home to the next. She had been told she was abandoned by her mother when she was only 2 years old, left on the steps of a church with nothing but a small note and a blanket. That's all she knew of her origins. No name, no story, just a blank space where her family should have been. Her thoughts drifted to William, her brother. Not by blood, but in every way that mattered. He was the only family she had ever truly known. She remembered when they first met, both of them still children in the foster system. She had been 10 and he was 7, wide-eyed and scared. He had been brought into the same foster family that had taken her in, and it hadn't taken long for them to bond. They shared the same hollow feeling of being unwanted, of not belonging. The foster parents they lived with were kind enough, providing the basics, food, shelter, even moments of care. But the biological children of the family, 4 in total, were different. They didn't see Stacy and William as equals. They saw them as the orphans, and they never let them forget it. Stacy could still hear their mocking voices in her mind. "Where are your real parents?" they'd ask, their words filled with venom. "Why doesn't anyone want you?" Even though Stacy tried to ignore them, the words still cut deep, and she could see how much they affected William. He was more sensitive, and the constant taunts from their foster siblings took their toll on him. That's why she always tried to be strong for him and made it her mission to protect him when no one else would. One memory in particular flooded back. Stacy had been 14, a freshman in high school. She'd come home late from school one day after a long, grueling day of trying to fit in, a task that felt impossible. As she walked into the house, something felt off. It was too quiet, and when she called for William, there was no answer. She started to worry, calling his name louder. "William?" she asked, her voice echoing down the hallway. There was a slight rustle from the closet down the hall. Curious, she walked toward it and noticed the door was ajar. She peeked inside and found William curled up in the corner, his knees drawn up to his chest. Stacy smiled at first, thinking he was trying to scare her, but something about his posture was different. "Are you hiding from me?" she teased, but William didn't respond. He just stayed there, tucked in on himself, staring at the floor. "William," she said more softly, kneeling down next to him. "What's going on?" He looked up at her, his eyes red and puffy from crying. They keep asking me where my parents are," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I told them they're at work, but they just keep laughing and saying I don't have real parents." Stacy's heart broke for him. She knew how it felt to be reminded of what they lacked, of the family they didn't have. But seeing him like this, so confused and hurt, made her feel an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Without saying a word, she wrapped her arms around him and held him close. "I'm sorry, William," she whispered. "I know it's hard, but you know what? We don't need them. We don't need their words." William sniffed, leaning into her embrace. "But they're right, Stacy. We don't have real parents." Stacy pulled back and cupped his face, looking him directly in the eyes. "We may not have parents like other people, but you have me. I'm your family, and I promise, no matter what happens, I'll take care of you. I'll be your mom and dad if I have to." William stared at her, his lip quivering, before finally nodding. "You promise?" "I promise," Stacy said, sealing the vow that had guided her life ever since. Back in the present, Stacy blinked, the family photograph still in front of her. That promise had shaped her, driven her, even as she moved through life without a clear direction. William was the reason she kept going. Even now, she carried that promise with her every day. With a deep breath, Stacy turned away from the photograph and took a few steps toward the kitchen, but something caught her eye, a glimpse of soft fabric beyond the living room. Claire's wardrobe, with its door slightly ajar, stood tall and elegant. Inside, beautiful dresses hung in neat rows, each one more exquisite than the last. She had seen Claire's wardrobe before, of course. It was hard not to notice such luxury. The shimmering fabrics, the tailored designs, everything Claire wore was a statement of grace and power. Stacy was a girl, after all, and like many girls, she had an unspoken attraction to beautiful clothes. Her own wardrobe was far more humble, but every time she passed Claire's, she couldn't help but imagine what it would be like to wear something so refined. Today, however, was different. The house was empty, and Stacy felt a strange tug of excitement, a childlike giddiness bubbling up inside her. Maybe, just maybe, she could try one of those dresses on. Just for a minute. What harm could it do? She had been working hard, earning her place in this household. Didn't she deserve a moment to feel beautiful? Before she could talk herself out of it, Stacy found her hands moving on their own. She carefully reached for one of Claire's dresses, a deep emerald green silk gown, elegant and flowing. It was the kind of dress she imagined seeing in a fairy tale ball, and as soon as she held it up, she could almost see herself dancing in it, twirling under the soft glow of candlelight. Her heart raced as she slipped out of her own clothes and into the gown. The fabric felt smooth and luxurious against her skin. Stacy stood in front of the full-length mirror, her breath catching in her throat. The dress was stunning, and she looked, dare she think it, gorgeous. For a fleeting moment, she wasn't just Stacy the cook, the girl from the foster system. She was someone else, someone important, someone who belonged in this grand house. She twirled slightly, watching the fabric flow around her legs. A small smile played at her lips. It was like she was in a dream. But suddenly, the front door opened. The sharp click of heels echoed through the hall, and Stacy's stomach dropped. It was Claire. Panic surged through her veins as the footsteps grew closer and closer. What have I done? This was a huge mistake. She had no time to think. Her hands scrambled to remove the dress, but Claire was already too close. Without thinking, Stacy grabbed her plain shirt and apron, slipping them over the dress and tucking the bottom hem into her pants as best as she could. The fabric bulged awkwardly beneath her apron, but it would have to do. With her heart pounding in her chest, Stacy slipped into the hallway, moving as fast as she could without drawing attention. She was nearly to the back stairs when, rounding a corner, she collided with Claire. Claire, startled but not fazed, raised an eyebrow. "Stacy?" she asked, her voice sharp. "What's the hurry?" Stacy kept her head low, trying to hide her expression, her pulse thundering in her ears. She forced herself to answer, though her voice shook. "Oh, nothing, just finishing up in the kitchen," she stammered, keeping her gaze on the floor. Claire narrowed her eyes, clearly sensing something off. "You're acting strange. What's going on?" Stacy felt the weight of the dress under her clothes, the soft silk pressing against her skin, making it impossible to stand still. Her hands clenched the fabric of her apron as she tried to compose herself. "Nothing," she mumbled. "I'm just busy. Is there anything you need?" Claire's gaze lingered on her for a moment too long, suspicion flickering in her eyes. But she eventually waved a dismissive hand. "No, just don't act so weird." With that, Claire turned and walked down the hall, her heels clicking once again. Stacy barely managed to breathe. She quickly made her way back to the kitchen, her mind racing. What had she been thinking? She could have been caught. Almost one had been, and now, for the rest of the day, she would have to work with Claire's dress tucked awkwardly under her clothes, hoping no one would notice. The afternoon passed slowly, each minute feeling like an hour. Every time she moved, the fabric shifted under her apron, and Stacy couldn't help but worry that someone, especially Claire, would notice something off. But thankfully, the family was too distracted during dinner. Daniel chattered excitedly about his day, and James and Claire were engaged in their own conversation. The evening had taken an unexpected turn, and what had started as a simple dinner was now spiraling into chaos. Stacy had almost made it through the evening without incident, but her heart sank when she felt James's eyes on her. He had noticed something, a small edge of fabric sticking out from under her shirt. She had tucked the dress as best as she could, but clearly not well enough. "Stacy," James called, his tone stern. "Come here." Stacy's legs felt like lead as she approached him, dread pooling in her stomach. Claire glanced between them, confused, her sharp eyes catching onto the tension in the air. James looked her over with a frown. "I gave you this job despite my wife's concerns. I believed in you, Stacy. But now I see you're hiding something under your shirt." He gestured toward the edge of the fabric sticking out. Claire's eyes widened slightly, though she said nothing. Stacy opened her mouth to explain, her voice shaking. I'm sorry, I only wanted to try it on, just once." Her words spilled out in a rush. "It was a silly mistake. I wasn't thinking. I'm really sorry." But the room fell silent, her apology hanging in the air, unanswered. James's face hardened. "Take off the shirt, Stacy," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Stacy stood frozen, her heart racing. She glanced at Claire, half expecting her to be angry, but instead Claire spoke up, her voice surprisingly calm. James, maybe... No, James interrupted, shaking his head. She needs to show us. Stacy, trembling, knew she had no choice. With shaky hands, she unbuttoned her shirt, pulling it off to reveal the emerald green dress she had tried on just moments before. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire's eyes widened in shock, and James stood still, his face unreadable. "I'm so sorry," Stacy whispered, tears threatening to spill. She knew there was no coming back from this, no explanation would be good enough. Without waiting for another word, Stacy turned and walked to her room. She could feel the weight of their stares on her back, the disappointment thick in the air. Her hands fumbled as she packed her few belongings into a small suitcase, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had been so foolish, and now she would lose the one good thing that had come into her life. As she zipped up her suitcase, a small figure appeared in the doorway. Daniel. He stood there, silent, watching her with wide eyes. He didn't say a word, but the sight of him there, confused and upset, made her heart ache even more. "Stacy." His voice was small, barely a whisper. Stacy wiped her eyes, trying to pull herself together. She didn't want him to see her like this. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said quietly, her voice cracking. "I have to go." Daniel didn't respond, but his eyes never left her. He simply stood there, as if waiting for her to change her mind. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, and Claire appeared behind Daniel, her face serious, her hand clutching something tightly. Stacy turned, all cried out, but before she could say anything, Claire spoke first. "You don't have to leave," Claire said, her voice firm but not unkind. "James was harsh. I get it. But you don't have to go." Stacy shook her head, her tears threatening to return. "I'm too embarrassed to stay. I shouldn't have done what I did." Claire took a step closer, her expression softening slightly. "Maybe so," she said. "But it's your choice. I won't force you to stay if you don't want to." Stacy nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her mistake. She was about to turn back to her suitcase when Claire's voice stopped her. "But before you go," Claire said, opening her palm, "there's just one thing I need to ask you." She held out a small wooden amulet, its smooth surface catching the light. "Why this?" Claire asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Of all the things, why take a wooden amulet?" Stacy's brow furrowed in confusion. "What?" Then her eyes fell on the amulet in Claire's hand, and instinctively her hand flew to her chest. Her fingers brushed over the spot where her own wooden amulet usually rested, but it wasn't there. She gasped. "That's mine!" she exclaimed. "I must have dropped it." Claire's expression shifted from confusion to surprise. "Yours?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "This is my amulet. I've had it for years." Stacy shook her head. "No, it's mine. I've had it since I was a child. It's the only thing I have left from my mother." Desperation filled her voice. "If you look at the back, it says, 'From Dad. With love.'" Claire froze. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Without saying a word, she turned the amulet over. The words were there, just as Stacy had said. Claire took a step back, her hand trembling slightly. "Wait here," Claire whispered, before rushing out of the room. Stacy stood there bewildered. Moments later, Claire returned, holding another identical amulet in her hand. "Look," she said, her voice unsteady. This is mine." She showed Stacy the second amulet, identical in every way, including the inscription on the back. Claire's eyes welled with tears, and for the first time since the confrontation with the dress, she smiled. A smile filled with recognition, with wonder. "Father gave me this amulet," she said softly, her voice breaking. "And now, you have the same one." Stacy stared at the two amulets in disbelief. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. How? Claire wiped her eyes, her smile growing as she stepped closer to Stacy. You said it was the only thing you had from your mother, she whispered. Stacy, I think your mother was my sister. Stacy's breath caught in her throat. The words seemed too surreal, too impossible. Your sister, she repeated, her voice barely audible. Claire nodded, tears streaming down her face. I can't believe it. After all these years. I've found you. Stacy felt the room spin around her. Just moments ago, she had been packing her bags, ready to leave in disgrace, and now Claire was saying they were family. It didn't feel real. It couldn't be real. Claire suddenly burst into sobs, wrapping her arms around Stacy tightly. I can't believe it, she cried, holding her close. I finally found you. Stacy stood there frozen, her mind struggling to catch up with the flood of emotions. This couldn't be happening. Just a few minutes ago, she had been accused of theft, and now she was Claire's niece. As Claire pulled back, her hands still gripping Stacy's, she called out, James, come here, you won't believe this. James rushed into the room, his face filled with confusion. What's going on? He asked, looking between them. Claire, still sobbing, explained everything. As she spoke, James's confusion slowly gave way to shock. He stared at Stacy, then at the amulets in Claire's hands. He didn't know what to say. When Claire finally finished, she turned back to Stacy, her eyes filled with joy and tears. You can forget what happened earlier, she said, her voice trembling. In fact, keep the dress. It's yours now. I'm just so happy we found each other. Stacy's head swam. She felt overwhelmed, lost in the whirlwind of emotions, unable to process everything that had just happened. After the whirlwind of emotions and revelations had settled, Stacy and Claire found themselves sitting at the kitchen table, the room filled with an air of disbelief and quiet reflection. The earlier tension was gone, replaced by the gravity of the truth that had come crashing down on both of them. Stacy was still reeling from the shock of discovering that Claire, the woman she had feared and respected from a distance, was her aunt. The connection between them ran deeper than either of them had ever imagined. Claire sat across from Stacy, her eyes still red from crying. She took a deep breath and began to share the painful story that had haunted her for years. I never thought I'd find Hazel's child, Claire began, her voice soft and heavy with sorrow. You see, your mother disappeared when she was still young. She got pregnant when she was just a teenager, and our family, we come from a conservative background. My parents were strict, proud people, and Hazel, well, she was terrified of what they'd do when they found out. Stacy listened intently, her heart aching for the young girl her mother had been, imagining the fear she must have felt. Hazel ran away, Claire continued, her voice breaking. She couldn't face our parents, and she didn't want to bring shame to the family. We searched for her, but Claire's face darkened. She was found dead not long after she disappeared. My parents, they didn't want to make much of it public. They buried everything quickly, both literally and figuratively. They were ashamed. Stacy's heart sank, the pain of losing the mother she had never known hitting her all over again. I knew Hazel, Claire said, wiping a tear from her cheek. I knew she wouldn't have had an abortion. She had such a good heart, always full of life. I couldn't believe that she would just leave like that, or that her story would end so suddenly. But every time I brought it up to my parents, every time I tried to talk about her, they shut me down. I fought with them over and over because I knew there was more to it. Stacy's chest tightened as she watched Claire's pain unfold. She had never known her mother, but hearing Claire talk about Hazel made her feel connected to her in a way she never had before. Claire looked at Stacy, her eyes searching her niece's face as if seeing Hazel in her. For the first time, Claire whispered, her voice trembling, I see her in you. Her eyes, her expressions. I can't believe I didn't see it sooner. Stacy didn't know what to say. The weight of the moment felt almost too much to bear. She had never imagined finding her family, and now here she was, sitting with her aunt, learning about the mother she never got to know. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "I want to hear your story, Stacey. All of it." And for the first time, Stacey opened up fully. She told Claire everything about being abandoned as a baby, moving through the foster system, growing up feeling alone and disconnected from the world. She talked about William, her bond with him, and how they had become each other's family in the absence of one. She spoke of the hardships, the bullying, the moments of hopelessness, and how she had fought to find her place in the world. By the time she finished, Claire's eyes were filled with tears again. "I can't believe what you've been through, kiddo," she said softly, "and I'm so sorry. I wish I had known sooner. I would have done something." Stacey shook her head. "I never thought I'd find my family," she admitted. "For so long I felt like I was drifting, like I didn't belong anywhere. But now—" Claire reached across the table and squeezed Stacey's hand. "Now you're home," she said firmly. "You're part of this family and you always will be." Despite Claire's insistence that Stacey stop cooking and start living her life more freely, Stacey continued to do her job. She refused to take advantage of her new circumstances, feeling that she needed to earn her place even with the newfound family connection. Claire admired her niece's strength and determination, but she couldn't help feeling that Stacey deserved more. "There must be something you want," Claire said one afternoon as they sat together in the garden. "You've worked so hard, but let me do something for you." Stacey thought for a moment before answering. "There is something," she said softly. "William, he's still in the foster system. He's become so independent since I left, but I want him out. I want him to have a chance." A few days later, with Claire and James's help, they were able to get William out of the foster system. The reunion between Stacey and William was filled with joy, the kind that only comes after long periods of separation. William, now older and more self-assured, had missed Stacey terribly. Seeing her again, after everything they had been through together, filled him with a happiness that words couldn't capture. Stacey didn't ask for much, but she did have one request: help William go to college. It was something she couldn't do on her own, and she wanted more than anything for her brother to have the opportunities she never did. Claire and James happily agreed, helping William with his college applications and even offering to cover his tuition. Despite the newfound security, Stacey continued her work as the family's cook, determined not to take advantage of her situation. She declined numerous offers from Claire to move into a larger, more comfortable room, preferring to stay in her small space near the kitchen. "I'm happy here," she insisted. "I've got everything I need." But one evening, after months of saving and planning, Stacey made an announcement. "I think it's time," she said, sitting down with Claire and James. "I've saved enough, and I want to move into my own apartment. It's not that I don't appreciate everything you've done for me. I need to know that I can do this on my own." Claire's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of pride. "I'm so proud of you," she said, hugging Stacey tightly. "You're everything Hazel would have wanted you to be: strong, independent, and kind." As the days passed, the bond between Claire and Stacey grew deeper. Stacey moved into her new apartment, continuing to visit Claire, James, and Daniel regularly. Recently, something had been lingering in the back of Stacey's mind. She hadn't told Claire about it yet, unsure of how to bring it up. But today, as the silence between them felt comfortable and familiar, Stacey decided it was time. "Claire," she began quietly, "I've been thinking." Claire looked up from her cup, her eyes warm with curiosity. "What about?" Stacey hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I want to meet my grandparents." Claire blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected that. "You do?" Stacey nodded. "Not because I feel like I need to, but because of you. You believed in Hazel. You fought for her when no one else would, And you went against them, even when it was hard. I feel like I owe it to you, and maybe I need some closure too." Claire's expression softened, a mix of pride and concern crossing her face. "I understand," she said gently. "It won't be easy, you know. They've changed, but there's a lot of history there. A lot of pain." "I'm not expecting anything," Stacey replied, "but I want to hear them out. And I want them to know that I'm okay. That despite everything, I found a family. I found you." Claire smiled, though there was sadness in her eyes. "You've grown so much, Stacey. I'll support you whatever you decide." A week later, Stacey found herself standing in front of a small, modest house on the outskirts of town. Stacey's heart raced, but she reminded herself that she wasn't here for herself. This was for Claire, for Hazel, and perhaps, in some way, for the family that had been broken for so long. Claire had offered to come with her, but Stacey had insisted on going alone. This was something she needed to do herself. With a deep breath, she rang the doorbell. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing an older woman with kind but weary eyes. Her silver hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and her face, though lined with age, still held traces of the beauty she must have once had. "How can I help you?" the woman asked. "My name is Stacey. I'm Hazel's daughter," Stacey replied softly. The woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes almost instantly, and before Stacey could say another word, the woman pulled her into a tight embrace. "Oh, my dear," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." Stacey stiffened at first, the unexpected rush of emotion catching her off guard, but then she relaxed, letting the woman, her grandmother, hold her. The embrace was warm and desperate, as though she was holding on to something she had feared she would never find again. "I'm sorry," the woman repeated, pulling back slightly to look at Stacey's face. "We made so many mistakes. We were so wrong. About everything." Just then, an older man appeared in the doorway, his face ashen as he took in the sight before him. He was tall and thin, his posture slightly hunched with age, but his eyes were sharp, filled with regret. When he heard who she was, he too looked as though he might cry. "Hazel," he muttered, his voice cracking. "You look just like her." Stacey swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment press down on her. "I've come to see you both," she said quietly, "not because I need anything, but because I felt like it was time." Her grandparents ushered her inside, both of them speaking in fragmented apologies, their voices thick with guilt and sorrow. They led her to the living room, where old photographs hung on the walls, pictures of Hazel, young and full of life, of Claire, and even of the grandparents themselves when they were younger. As they sat together, her grandmother reached for Stacey's hand, holding it tightly. "We were wrong to shut Hazel out," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We were scared. Scared of what people would think, scared of what would happen, and we lost her because of it. We lost everything." Tears filled the older woman's eyes as she spoke, and her grandfather sat beside her, nodding silently, his face pale with remorse. Stacey listened, feeling a mix of emotions swirling inside her: anger, sadness, and even pity. But mostly she felt a strange sense of closure. This couple, once so proud and unforgiving, had been broken by their own choices. They had suffered too. "I'm not angry with you," Stacey said finally, her voice steady but quiet. "It's good to know who my family is, and I accept your apology, but it'll take time. I don't think we can go back and fix everything, but I'm willing to try, slowly." Her grandparents nodded, their faces filled with relief. Tears streamed down her grandmother's cheeks as she whispered, "Thank you, Stacey. Thank you for giving us a chance." The visit, though emotional and intense, gave Stacey the closure she needed. She wasn't angry anymore, and she didn't need their approval or acceptance to move forward. But knowing where she came from, and knowing that her grandparents regretted their choices, gave her a sense of peace. As she left their house that day, Stacey felt lighter, freer. It would take time to truly reconnect with her grandparents, if that was even possible. But she wasn't rushing. She would continue living her life, building her future, one day at a time. Back at Claire's house, Stacy found herself sitting at the kitchen table again, her cup of tea cooling in front of her. Claire sat across from her, listening as Stacy recounted the visit. "They apologized," Stacy said softly. "A lot. I think they're really sorry." Claire nodded, tears filling her eyes. "They should be. They made terrible mistakes. But I'm glad you went, Stacy. I'm glad you heard them out." Stacy smiled, a sense of calm settling over her. "It's good to know that, despite everything, I have you." Claire reached across the table and took Stacy's hand. "You'll always have me," she said with a smile. "Your family, Hazel's family, and that's all that matters." Stacy nodded, feeling a sense of contentment she hadn't felt in a long time. Life wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead. But for the first time, Stacy knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. And that was enough. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Stacy continued to live her life, slowly rebuilding the pieces of her past while carving out her future. Her family, both new and old, stood by her, and with each passing day she felt more and more like she was finally home.